Okay, now we're recording. Hello, friends. Us again. Ah, we're good. Shh. Don't scare the children. We're going to sing you another folk song. And this folk song is called There's a Hole in My Bucket. Normally, this song is sung by either a Georgie or a Henry, I've heard it as well, to someone named Liza. Well, we decided...
Liza?
No.
Oh.
We decided we would just use our names. So this is our take on the familiar folk song, There's a Hole in My Bucket. Here we go.
There's a hole in my bucket, dear Laura, dear Laura. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Laura, a hole.
Then fix it, dear Kyle, oh Kyle, dear Kyle. Then fix it, dear Kyle, fix it.
With what shall I fix it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I fix it, dear Laura? With what?
With a straw, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. With a straw, dear Kyle, with a straw.
But a straw is too long, too long, too long. But a straw is too long, dear Laura, too long.
Then cut it, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. Then cut it, dear Kyle, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I cut it, dear Laura? With what?
With a knife, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. With a knife, dear Kyle. I know you have one in your pocket.
But my knife is too dull, too dull, too dull. But my knife is too dull, dear Laura, too dull.
Then whet it, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. Then whet it, dear Kyle, whet it.
I could just replace this one.
Not for the sake of the folk song, Kyle. You need to whet it.
Oh.
Just run with it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Laura?
What shall I whet it?
With what shall I wet it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I wet it, dear Laura? With what?
With a stone, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. With a stone, dear Kyle, with a stone.
But the stone is too dry, dear Laura, dear Laura. But the stone is too dry, dear Laura, too dry.
Then wet it, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. Then wet it, dear Kyle, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I wet it?
No. With what shall I wet it?
With what shall I wet it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I wet it, dear Laura? With what?
With water, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. With water, dear Kyle, with water. Duh.
With what shall I get it, dear Laura, dear Laura? With what shall I get it, dear Laura? With what?
In your bucket, dear Kyle, dear Kyle, dear Kyle. In your bucket, dear Kyle, in your bucket.
There's a hole in my bucket, dear Laura, dear Laura. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Laura, a hole.
Oh yeah. I think you need a new bucket. Bye, friends. Can you press the stop button?